For nearly half a century, standing in proud isolation at the harbour end of the Esplanade, was this magnificent piece of confectionery, the original Weymouth Pavilion. I'd like to show how it came to be there and to explain what was involved in creating the pier on which it sat. For centuries, Weymouth's harbour and quays have been vital for the town's prosperity and growth. The harbour is the natural mouth of the River Wey, which enters the town from Radipole, turning sharply to the east, where it meets the steep hill to the south, and then passing the Nothe promontory. Quays and jetties have been built and extended to cater for the progression of vessels using the port, but keeping the entrance clear and navigable has always been a challenge. On the south side, a short Stone Pier breakwater has existed in one form or another for hundreds of years as protection from southeasterly storms. On the north, the Melcombe side, a barrier was needed to prevent sand and silt accumulating and blocking the harbour. Originally, this was a simple mound of stone and rubble extending from the as yet unmade Esplanade. In 1721, Melcombe Quay was extended and widened just past the George Inn, while 2 years later, in 1723, piles were driven out from the short jetty to check the outset of the tide on the north side of the harbour and to keep the channel in a more direct course. Devonshire and Pulteney buildings, around 1805 to 1812, had yet to be built, so the land between the harbour and the Esplanade was still flat and vulnerable. On the south side of the harbour, near Hope Square, an inlet known as McSander's Hole, a useful swing area for ships, was filled in during 1781 for building development. That same year, Melcombe Quay was extended further. In those days, Melcombe Regis consisted of little more than St Mary's Street, St Thomas Street, St Nicholas Street, and the streets linking them, and there were few buildings beyond the site of the King's statue. To the north of Melcombe was the Narrows, a tract of shingle and sand which separated the bay from Radipole Lake. This was progressively built on from 1801, when a Mr Bushrod was contracted to build 163 feet of Esplanade wall and to fill the ground behind it. By the time that was finished in 1803, the Esplanade was nearly a mile in length, from the turnpike on Dorchester Road down to the quay. The King had contributed £400 towards its cost. King George III's visits brought new prosperity to the town and a surge of development which was to form the by now famous seafront to the splendour we see today. A guide of 1803 said the Esplanade, which is kept in most perfect repair, is a beautiful raised terrace of considerable length and breadth, with a slope gradually descending to the sands, and near the centre of the bathing machines and opposite the royal residence are flights of steps of Portland stone. Among the frenzy of building along the Esplanade in the early 19th century were the elegant terraces of Pulteney and Devonshire buildings, with their backs to the harbour. In 1809, the developers were ordered to construct a breakwater and apron, which effectively was the start of the pier as we know it. Disaster struck in November 1824. A witness wrote, "Such a night as the preceding and this morning I have never witnessed. I may say Weymouth has suffered to the amount of £30,000. The Esplanade, from Thomas's Library to the turnpike, is quite destroyed. The machines driven against the terrace, shivered to atoms. Stone posts on the Esplanade driven against the houses, and the whole road from the statue strewed with masses of rock and shingle. In short, a scene of devastation you can have no idea of. Boats sunk in the river, others were driven out to sea, and the stone seat in the pier has disappeared. The breakwater at the lookout, that's under the nose, is destroyed, as is the ferry house leading to Portland. Another account read, "In one of the most tempestuous gales of wind from the south-southeast, accompanied with the highest tide which this town has ever experienced, it commenced about 4 o'clock on Tuesday morning and continued with unabated fury for several hours. The pier at the entrance of the harbour is nearly demolished, together with the greater part of the Esplanade. The different quays were deluged, and the lower rooms of the houses in various parts of the town were inundated. The backwater became united with the sea, and one boy lost his life in attempting to cross the Narrows. The road leading to Preston was broken up, and the waves rushed over it, inundating Lodmore Flat. The town lost little time in repairing the enormous damage. Within months, builder T. Vining was given the task of rebuilding the Esplanade, this being recorded on a commemorative stone on the seafront. A big step forward came in 1840, when a major change was made to the port area. A pier, infilled with a mixture of Portland stone and shingle concrete, was built on the northern edge of the harbour. It was functional, but also effectively extended the Esplanade, which was already considered one of the best promenades in England. The stone or outer pier on the south side, at the mouth of the harbour, was very exposed and was frequently storm damaged. In 1828, wedges were driven into the joints of the wall to support the stones that were giving way, and large stones were placed against the wall to protect it. But those stones proved a hazard, as in November 1840 a French fishing smack, in attempting to enter the harbour in a furious storm, grounded on the rocks. She eventually got off, having sustained considerable damage to her hull. In 1836 a committee was appointed to consider the cleansing and deepening of the harbour. A steam dredger was brought in to carry out the works. Plans were drawn up to extend both piers, and the contract was finished in August 1840. These ambitious works extended the available space for commercial and other ships, while giving greater protection, a major improvement for the harbour. Those alterations enabled boats to proceed from the quay at any time and tide. Incidentally, for the first time in history, two men were able to see the town and its harbour from the air. For in 1842 an enormous crowd watched Mr. Green and his accomplice ascend in their magnificent hot-air balloon, the Albion, soaring to a height of 1,500 feet. The landing stage for steamers was repaired in 1853, but the state of that Pile Pier itself was again causing alarm. So in 1854 the corporation obtained an Act of Parliament for a major extension to it. Famous engineers William and Joseph Cubitt were invited to design and supervise this work. Their expensive £12,000 scheme was warmly welcomed. James Payne of Rotherhithe, Surrey, was appointed contractor. Lines of square timber piles 6 feet apart were driven along the inner and outer faces of the existing masonry pier. Between those were close-boarded timber sheet piles, inside of which were trenches filled with concrete. But it did not go well. The pier extension works were heavily criticised by a William Lohman, who complained that inferior timber was being used for the piles, and that far too little creosote was being injected to preserve them. Incredibly, it was even described as an ill-erected pier on a published map. There were accusations of fraud by the contractor, which were later disproved. Despite this, the pier extension was completed by May 1860. The new walk along it was immensely popular with the public. Being a most substantial structure, it adds greatly to the effect of the present outline of our Esplanade, as well as to the efficiency of the convenience of the harbour generally. It will form a favourite promenade, notwithstanding the proposed toll, At a special meeting to discuss a report by civil engineers Cubitt on the completed pier extension, the Mayor decided he had a more important matter to discuss. He'd received an anonymous letter regarding some bathing customs of Weymouth, which he said was a matter of some importance. He said the letter complained of the proximity of the bathing place on the Esplanade promenade of the town and alluded to the want of decency on the part of the sunbathers. As a remedy, a writer suggested that the machine proprietors should be required to provide a number of pair of drawers for the use of the male bathers. That was referred to the licensing committee. Presumably some skinny dipping had been going on. All was not well with other parts of the quay. The harbour master was concerned about the state of the piles near the George corner, and the landing stage for the steamers was much shaken owing to the increased traffic. The red gas light at the end of the pier was often not lit due to the poor gas supply in the town generally. However, the public loved the extended walk on the pier. Wheeler's Guide of 1867 said it forms a very attractive continuation of the Esplanade and enables promenaders to enjoy a larger share of your sea breeze that can be obtained further inshore. A small fee of a penny introduces the visitor to this Elysium of marine atmosphere, and he can here imbibe a medicine for his ailments, if he has them, without the terrors of a long doctor's bill in prospectu. Victorians obviously had to heed the call of nature, so in 1858 urinals were installed at each end of the pier. I've never been sure what the ladies were expected to do. Back on the quayside, the most significant development in the 19th century was the laying of the Quay Tramway Railway in 1865. Initially, this was simply for horse-drawn freight wagons. It was not until some 15 years later that small loco engines were permitted. The single rail line ran along the quayside wall as far as the roundhouse end of Devonshire Buildings, where a cargo stage was built in 1877 for the vessels of the burgeoning Channel Islands traffic. Meanwhile, on the south side of the harbour, the old Stone Pier breakwater, although substantially built in 1827, did not give adequate protection to the harbour, the Pile Pier, or even to the beach in times of easterly storms. So Borough Surveyor Barlow Morgan prepared plans to enlarge the Stone Pier. John Jackson of Glasgow won the contract to extend it by 250 feet in concrete topped with roach stone. Its completion in 1878 was marked by a lavish ceremony attended by hundreds of townsfolk and dignitaries. Guns were fired and a memorial stone was laid with a silver trowel. Within a few years it was clear that the Pile Pier was literally falling apart. In June 1877, a council resolution stated that the Pile Pier, having become insecure through the decay of many of its supporting piles, steps be taken to prevent any accident occurring thereon until the structure be put into a proper state of repair. That, as it is necessary to repair the pier, immediate steps be taken to secure funds to meet the cost. The surveyor reported that many of the piles were eaten away between wind and water. Spalls were washed away and the whole place was in a very bad condition. The pier was described as dangerous to the public. The stonework and the surface were also damaged, and as an emergency the engineer had to install steel tie rods to keep the structure together. Despite its condition, the pier remained open to the public, and when regattas were held, the admission tolls were increased to 6p. An elegant toll house, shelter and lavatories were built at the pier entrance in 1883. In 1887, an ambitious bill was placed before Parliament for major improvements in Weymouth. This provided for a new pier and many street improvements and enabled the corporation to take over the gasworks and the waterworks, among many other things. A prime mover in this was Sir Richard Nicholas Howard. Howard came to Weymouth aged 14, qualified as a solicitor, and became very influential and immensely wealthy. He formed the company which built the Royal Jubilee Hall of 1887. He owned numerous properties and majority shares in both the Weymouth and the Portland Gasworks. Howard was also Mayor of Weymouth for a record 8 times, only to resign his last office to become Town Clerk. Some resented his power and influence. He was knighted in 1885 for the numerous improvements to the town and its harbour which he had promoted. Mr. S. Fowler of the Great Western Railway Company supported the Bill of 1887, saying that if the depth of water were increased to 16 feet, a steamer service could be put on between Weymouth and St. Malo, and they could improve the service to the Channel Islands. The bill also sought 1. To control, direct and regulate the method of fishing in the tidal waters of the backwater. 2. To control, direct and regulate the bathing in and adjacent to the borough. 3. To control, direct and regulate the use of the sands, also as to cycles on the Esplanade and footpaths, and also for the maintenance, improvement and regulation of the swannery. The population in 1887 of Weymouth was just 13,715. That year, 1887, was the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. It was a time of optimism, and Weymouth rose to the occasion. An elaborate Jubilee clock tower was planned for the Esplanade, and the magnificent Royal Jubilee Hall was built in the heart of the town centre. Also in 1887, to symbolise the dawn of the new technology of the age, a large crowd gathered on the quayside to watch divers laying telephone cables across the harbour to connect Old Weymouth with Melcombe Regis. The Pile Pier, besides being a popular recreational pier, was vitally important for commerce and berthing. So in 1888-9 a new passenger landing stage and baggage hall was built for the Great Western Railway's Channel Island service, to which the rails on the quay were then extended. On the dawn of the 20th century, the Borough Council took the first steps towards introducing electricity. They selected a site on the western shore of the backwater for the power station and applied for a £50,000 loan to get the scheme underway. The Western Chronicle in July 1900 said, "We shall be glad to see Weymouth, and especially the fine Esplanade in front, illuminated by electric light. But there were 2 things which should proceed first, and that is the erection of a good pavilion for band concerts and a handsome modern pier." From before the days of George III's visits, Weymouth had always taken pride in its theatres. In 1803 the Royal Assembly Rooms on the seafront was described as being lofty, light and a spacious building, every way adapted to the purpose for which it is intended, and in which upwards of 100 couples may dance with ease and pleasure. The theatre had recently been fitted up in a style of elegance that does equal credit to the management and the architect. A Theatre Royal in St. Nicholas Street had been erected in the 18th century, but by the 1880s had become run down. The enormous new Jubilee Hall of 1887 was versatile and successful, but that hall was surrounded by buildings, so was largely hidden from the view of visitors, most of whom arrived by train at King Street. The boisterous and fun-loving Edwardian era now loomed, and the public now looked for a modern and elegant venue for music halls, plays and variety entertainment. A fine new theatre in a prominent and convenient location was desperately needed, but the town could not decide where it should be. Since 1886 there had been determined moves to build it on the sands opposite King Street. The mayor and some councillors argued that the position was central and convenient for the thousands of people who came by rail from all parts of the country. Others strongly objected, saying building there would interfere with the lovely sweep of the bay. The Act of 1887 had foreseen the developments, and in defining the limits of deviation, provided for both contingencies. In September 1900, by a vote of 13 votes to 7, the council decided that the most suitable site for a pavilion is near the entrance to the pier, and so the scheme moved forward. The town desperately needed a place where the band could play inside and visitors could go for shelter. More importantly, the town wanted to prolong the tourist season, which they contended would help by the erection of a pavilion in close proximity to the sea. In April 1902, a special committee of the Town Council had a change of mind, reporting that it is advisable that the pier and said pavilion should be erected at a point north of the Jubilee clock, within the limits of deviation as laid down in the Weymouth and Melcombe Regis Corporation Act of 1887, and that such pier and pavilion be erected by a private company, providing the same can be so arranged. Others again objected to this, saying that a pier and pavilion stuck in the bay would spoil the graceful curve, and the accommodation really required was to cater for people in wet weather. The recommendation was carried by 14 to 4, but the private promoter of the Jubilee Clock scheme was given just 4 weeks to decide whether he could form a company to carry out the work. The public kept up the pressure for the long-talked-of pavilion. On a July day in 1902, thousands of trippers visited Weymouth from the west of England. The morning was brilliantly fine, but towards the latter part of the afternoon the sky became overcast and subsequently rain set in. Once again the need for a pavilion was plainly demonstrated. People arrived quite unprepared for a change in the atmospheric conditions, with the result that the fair sex had to walk the streets with towels thrown over their shoulders to prevent the flimsy blouses from becoming saturated in the wet. In the event, nothing came of the private enterprise scheme, so in March 1906 the council finally decided to build a pavilion on the pier at an estimated cost of £12,500. It was to be erected immediately to the left of the entrance to the pier, for which land had to be reclaimed from the tidal part of the beach. The council's engineer, W. Barlow Morgan, now worked up the design for the preliminary works, which involved a widened carriage drive approach and the erection of a new stone and concrete retaining wall. The intervening space was to be filled in with sand and earth to form a base upon which the pavilion would be built. The contract for the wall and the reclamation was awarded to Messrs. Playfair and Toole, all for £675. This company at the time was already busy constructing the enormous oil fuel tanks for the Admiralty, which for a century lined Portland Beach Road. The design for the walls and piles specified a newly developed reinforced ferro-concrete patented by the French engineer Francois Hennebeek just a few years earlier. Council engineer Barlow Morgan supervised the work with great success. The design of the pavilion was subject to a competition with a prize of 100 guineas. Entrants were anonymous, but after the winner had been chosen, it was revealed that the architects were to be Messrs. Magnall and Littlewoods of Manchester. In February 1908, the council advertised for tenders for the erection of the pavilion itself. Tenders were accepted in March 1908, and incredibly, the main contractors were given less than 8 months to complete the whole works. Confidence was high that the deadline would be met, for in August 1908 an advert appeared for a pantomime to open on Boxing Day that year. Messrs. Wakeham Brothers of Portland and Plymouth were given the job of erecting the building itself, for the sum of £5,759. Wakeham Brothers had already left their mark on the area, for just 2 years earlier they had completed the new Portland Lighthouse, and they went on to build a large Wesleyan church in Easton Square, Portland. A tender of £2,120 by Messrs Dorman Long and Co. of London was accepted for the supply and fixing of the steel and ironwork framework for the new building. The final main contract was for the vast amounts of ornamental fibrous plaster to decorate the interior, which was awarded to theatre specialists A. R. Dean and Sons of Birmingham at a cost of £582. The corporation was determined that the magnificent new pavilion would be a very handsome structure. After all, this was in the peak of the exuberant and fun-loving Edwardian period. It was stated it is proposed to roof it in with zinc in preference to glass, which invariably sweats and allows moisture to fall into the auditorium. Glass will largely be used in the structure of the side walls, and there will be plenty of sheltered verandas running around the whole. The auditorium is designed to seat 1,200 people and will include a stage for dramatic and other entertainments. Torquay was becoming very envious. Their local paper complained that what an example Weymouth furnishes to the town council of Torquay. Weymouth has a population of less than 20,000, and it has the advantage of being governed by an up-to-date and enterprising body of men, and consequently the town is very prosperous. Hence the decision to erect a £14,000 pavilion. The building was virtually finished when, in November 1908, they invited offers to provide refreshments for the 2 buffet cafes and the large tea room. This new Weymouth Pavilion was opened by the Earl of Shaftesbury on the 21st of December 1908. It was described thus: "The new structure is of handsome oriental design, and it has been built on land reclaimed from the sea close to the approach to the pier. The interior is fitted as a modern theatre richly embellished in gold and white, the style adopted being Louis XV. Around the exterior of the building is a balcony, from which a splendid view of the bay is obtained. In inaugurating that magnificent pavilion, the Earl said he hoped it would meet the requirements of Weymouth and serve as a place for providing the best possible entertainment for men of the British Navy." The description went on: "There are 2 main entrances for stalls, ground circle and circle. The decorations of the surroundings are in ivory white, featuring occasional mirrors. The ceiling is of fibrous plaster with ornamental relief, treated with a quaint but suitable decorative scheme picked out in gold. The orchestra stalls are provided with carpet and capable of seating 200. Every seat affords an ample and clear view to witness every performance. The acoustic properties prove to be excellent. The balconies are tea terraces giving a noble view of the bay." Weymouth's architectural historian Eric Ricketts said it was one of the first delights to assail the eye of thousands of visitors. This Far Eastern confection, white against the dark green of the Nothe, often reflected in the still water. The interior was Theatreland Baroque at its best. It was a striking design, with an octagonal dome over the auditorium and a pair of square towers at the front. At the stage end were 4 turrets, 1 to each corner of the stage. On entering the spacious foyer, a pair of swing doors led to the auditorium. The tip-up seats were upholstered in crimson velvet. A bioscope projector was installed and the whole building was centrally heated. A special train brought journalists from London to join the local press for the first performance, a Christmas pantomime, Mother Goose. A resident pavilion orchestra was formed under the musical director John Howgill. The new theatre soon attracted the best variety acts from across the country, including one described as the great sensational ladder feat, the most daring and skillful hand-balancing feat ever performed. There were also orchestral concerts and Shakespearean plays. Not everything went smoothly. In June 1914, the council sued one actor for being drunk on stage. He couldn't stand up without holding on to the props, but apparently he did remember his lines. In May 1912, King George V arrived in his royal yacht to witness some spectacular naval exercises and pioneering aerial displays. This remarkable film shows the King embarking at the landing stage steps to be greeted by the Mayor, Alderman Bartle Pye, and all the dignitaries. His Majesty then walked past the cheering crowds by the pavilion. Some enjoying the view from the balcony. You can clearly see the charming pier entrance toll house of 1883. Here's 16 years old Prince Albert, later King George VI, walking past a sign for the skating rink to his lovely car. Roller skating was now a national craze, so a rink was laid out on the harbour side of the pavilion. It was so popular that an enclosed rink was added to the back of the theatre, which in 1911 was transformed into a palm court for teas and dances. Back to the King's visit, all the town's public buildings were colourfully decorated, and a local paper said in the evening, the crowning illumination of all was the pavilion, which was strikingly outlined, providing a brilliant background to the animated scenes of the Esplanade and Alexandra Gardens. Having successfully got the new theatre up and running, in 1914 the council decided to lease it to a prominent local businessman, Ernest Wheeler, who ran it up to World War II. The pavilion remained open throughout the Great War and played a big part in providing entertainment for troops of various nationalities who found themselves in Weymouth. After the war, Weymouth Operatic Society was formed in September 1921, and their first show, HMS Pinafore, was performed in May 1922 at the Pavilion Theatre. The Society's association with the site, mainly with their popular comic musical productions, continues to this day. With the fine pavilion in place, I'll now skim through the other developments of the adjoining pier and quayside throughout the rest of the 20th century. Shipping and commercial business in Weymouth Harbour was burgeoning, but the pier was suffering. In November 1930, the council signed an agreement with ferry operator Great Western Railways for a major expansion of the pier. A scheme was drawn up to widen the old pier and to extend it using ferro-concrete piles and Greenheart timber posts. It was designed in two parts. First, a solid portion in which filling was held by retaining walls built on piles. Then beyond was an open portion built entirely on piles, under which a half-tide bank was constructed to prevent silt from the bay entering the harbour. This major expansion enabled one passenger vessel, 3 cargo and 2 pleasure steamers to be dealt with simultaneously. Double railway lines were laid and 5 electrically operated cranes were set up. The railway platform was lengthened to accommodate more coaches. A dredger was brought in to deepen the harbour, and while the old rounded portion of the pier was being demolished, a sunken barge with a cargo of block stone was discovered. Whether this was anciently sunk by accident or design is not known. The entire pier was given electric illumination. On the promenade section of the pier, 3 double-deck shelters were provided and another for bathers, and an elaborate diving stage. Remarkably, this very expensive scheme, £150,000, made no charge on the rates, as Great Western Railways and the harbour undertaking profits were sufficient to cover the costs. The main contractor was Bolton and Lakin, who had recently built the new town bridge. Over 100 men were employed over 2.5 years on that scheme. Most of the pier was laid out for public pleasure and entertainment, while the railway platform's track and cargo deck were fenced off for security. It was said that 500 miles of steel were used in the construction, along with 2,100 tons of cement and 7,000 tons of granite. It was a proud event for the town when the new look pier was officially opened on the 13th of July 1933 by the Prince of Wales, soon to become King Edward VIII.
Your Royal Highness, the extension of the borough and the completion of this reconstruction work constitute perhaps the most important steps in the progress of the town since its first charter was granted by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I thank you sincerely for your welcome, and I'm glad to be here today to associate myself with the extension of the borough boundaries, which will enlarge the town to 5 times its present area. I'm glad to learn that the new pier, the new berths for cargo boats, and the electric crane tracks will bring your harbour up to date and add materially to the prosperity of Weymouth. I'm grateful for your welcome. I am only sorry that the weather delayed my landing here at 12:30. I now have much pleasure in declaring open reconstruction harbour.
Among the crowds were 2,000 children, some of whom were aboard a pair of Cousins paddle steamers moored alongside. The occasion not only marked the pier expansion, but the borough itself was expanded to take in the rural villages of White Regis, Radipole, Upwey, Preston and Sutton Points. Everything was set for a bright and prosperous future, all shattered 6 years later, of course, by the Second World War. The pavilion and pier were requisitioned by the military, and the entire area was strictly out of bounds to the public. 800 Moroccans from the French army were initially housed in the pavilion, which was later used as a medical centre during the evacuation of the Channel Islands. The pavilion suffered bomb damage in April 1942 and was then taken over by the Admiralty. The pavilion is seen prominently in these remarkable colour pictures taken in the run-up to D-Day. With the arrival of peace, business on the adjoining pier and quayside rapidly recovered, and the Channel Islands' commercial and ferry services boomed. But the pavilion was left in a poor state after the war, and arguments raged over who should pay for repairs. In 1947 it was leased to the Buxton Theatre Circuit, who installed a new cinema projection system. Then in 1950 the theatre was renamed the Ritz, considered a more glamorous title. A new management company of local businessmen took over the venue in September 1951. Shows, musicals and comedies were very popular in those austere post-war years. In 1953, repairs and restoration work began on the building, including the renewal of the roof and repainting of its wooden exterior. Tragedy struck on the 13th of April 1954 when a decorator's blow lamp set the cladding alight, resulting in a disastrous fire which quickly destroyed half of the building. The Edwardians are often blamed for misguidedly building a theatre containing so much wood, but consider this 1908 specification. There were adequate fire escapes, duplicate staircases, several fire hydrants within the building, 3 fire plugs outside, strategically placed Minimax fire extinguishers. The scenery was painted on flame-proof material, and there were no open fireplaces. Of course, by 1954, little of that had been maintained. The council's insurers decreed that the new replacement theatre should be built on the same site, and so construction of the new theatre and ballroom began in 1958. The designer was acclaimed theatre architect Samuel Beverley, who sadly died while his creation was taking shape. A competition was held to name the new venue, and logically Weymouth Pavilion was chosen. The reincarnated pavilion, which had cost £154,000, was officially opened by the Mayor on the 15th of July 1960, when the town regained the theatre it had always wanted. When built, the seaward side of the pavilion was directly over the water. In passing, further back, the harbour wall of Custom House Quay was in a dangerous state after the war. The council decided to completely reconstruct it and widen the quay and roadway. The robust scheme, 1949 to 1952, was designed by council engineers, and the contractors were Wilson Lovett and then A.E. Farr, who at the time were building huge new piers at Portland. Further widening and upgrading took place in 1960. This transformed and secured that important approach to the commercial and pleasure pier. The old Stone Pier on the south side remains vital for the protection of the harbour. It takes a pounding in easterly storms, as here in the 1980s. Damage was severe, so the outer section had to be totally reconstructed. Extensive work had been carried out in the early 20th century, when this navigation light platform was erected. As in 1878, the completed work was marked by a big ceremony in April 1988. By the 1970s, the harbour business was changing rapidly. Loose, bulk freight was ending. New roll-on, roll-off ferries had to be accommodated, and the council responded in a big way. In 1971-72, the pier was widened yet again to create a new terminal and a large car park to serve both the ferry port and Weymouth Pavilion. This new link-span ramp for roll-on, roll-off cross-channel car ferries was inaugurated in May 1973. This scheme was so successful that in 1978 an even larger area was reclaimed from the sea to handle the expanding international traffic. In this major scheme, completed in 1980, this obliterated much of the old Pile Pier. In one early year, this expanded port handled 750,000 passengers, 130,000 imported cars, including 36,000 Fiestas and Fiats. That phase was not to last, as the days of traditional ferries were numbered. In 1987, in a far cry from Cousins' old paddle steamers, revolutionary Condor hydrofoil catamarans were introduced for the Weymouth to Channel Islands service. Reducing the crossing time to 2 hours, they were popular and a great success. However, it was much later found that the turbulence caused by these powerful vessels was causing scour under the pier walls. A big contract to restore the quay wall was let in 2012, which included tubular piles driven to replace the damaged sheet steel ones. Unforeseen problems were encountered due to records of the old pier construction being lost, causing the cost to escalate to £4.5 million. A blow came when Condor Ferries announced the acquisition of a much larger hydrofoil, which could only fit into number 1 berth. The quay there would have to be upgraded and strengthened, but the council decided they could not justify spending a further £10 million needed for the work, despite the service bringing in nearly £8 million per annum to the local economy. The outcome was that the entire Condor ferry service transferred to Poole, despite limitations of that port. For the first time in 200 years, Weymouth could not or would not upgrade the infrastructure to keep the commercial and ferry port going. What was once called the Pile Pier, then the Commercial and Pleasure Pier, has now been renamed the Peninsula, seen by some as just another piece of real estate ripe for development. The cranes were removed and the shoreside passenger and freight facilities written off, so bringing to an end the long and remarkable story of this attractive little cross-channel port. Whatever the future holds for the pier, the harbour side must be maintained. In the summer of 2019, work started on a major reconstruction of 76 metres of the quay wall with steel sheet piles, and the ferry steps office and kiosk were demolished. And all the once bustling port terminal buildings were flattened by early 2021. All the once popular leisure facilities at the end of the pleasure pier, including the cafe, lookout and diving stages, were demolished. Then the final chapter of Weymouth's historic Quay tramway came when the council decided that reported problems for some cyclists overrode any potential the unique line may have held for the future. The total removal of the rails was welcomed by some, but many witnessed with dismay the tearing up of one of the town's most famous historic features. For a few years, a major tourist attraction remained on the pier, dominating the skyline from far afield. On this 53-metre high Jurassic Tower, originally called the Sea Life Tower, a gondola lifted up to 70 passengers on a rotating flight for an inspiring panoramic view over Weymouth Bay, the harbour and beyond. But it was not to last. With everything else on the pier being demolished, the tower was left in a not-so-splendid isolation, and visitors stopped going to it. Accordingly, the owner, Merlin Entertainment, announced in 2019 that the once popular tower had been sold and would be dismantled. Meanwhile, the Pavilion Theatre, with its ocean room behind, was under threat. From 2013, various official business and master plans raised the spectre of the entire peninsula site being cleared and redeveloped. The council-run pavilion was running at a big deficit. It needed updating, and demolition was on the cards. Salvation came with a Save the Pavilion campaign and a petition launched by businessman Phil Say and friends. This gained enthusiastic public support, and so eventually the council decided to hand over control and management to Mr. Say's non-profit community interest company on a lease which secures it all until 2043. With tremendous volunteer support, Weymouth Pavilion was then transformed. In a short time, patronage for the shows more than doubled. Major enhancements included a new piano bar restaurant, general refurbishments, a new roof, and, to cap it all, in 2018, a spectacular multicoloured floodlighting scheme. Shafts of programmable coloured lights drape the pilasters around the building, creating a scintillating nighttime scene across the water. This story should have closed there, but through 2020 to 2021, with the global pandemic of COVID-19, the pavilion faced its greatest ever challenge. Through the enforced closure, the determination of the management, staff and supporters ensured the survival and rebirth of Weymouth's much-loved theatre. The story of Weymouth's piers and pavilion is ongoing, and we are certain to see many more changes on this prominent part of the seafront and harbour side in the years ahead.